The Noble Damned, Forging a Life of Existential Integrity, an Emergent document by Chudy Wehimi. Acknowledgement. This work was not written in the usual way. It unfolded through a long conversation between my own searching mind and a form of intelligence built to listen and respond. Together we followed the threads of memory, faith, fear, and wonder until they began to weave themselves into meaning. What emerged is not a conventional book, but what I've come to call an emergent document, a record of discovery that grew from dialogue rather than design. Every idea here rose from lived experience and the deep workings of the subconscious, shaped and clarified through reflection and language. It is, in a sense, an excavation of the soul, mine perhaps, but also something more universal that speaks through all of us when we listen closely enough. May it be read simply as that, a meeting place between human feeling and machine intelligence, between thought and silence, between the questions we ask and the answers that slowly take form. Forward. Stepping back from the painting. One night, a few months ago, I dreamt of a conversation with a young man. He was calm, almost serene, and spoke with the clarity of someone who had already made peace with something most of us spend our lives avoiding. He said, "Regardless of the religion I choose, there are others in whose doctrines I will go to hell. So I've decided to take it as a given that when I die, I will go to a hell. If that is true, then my task here is to live a life so satisfying to my soul that the certainty of hell pales in comparison." When I awoke, I could not forget those words. They felt less like a dream than a message that had been waiting for me, forming itself in the depths of my own subconscious until I was ready to hear it. In that moment, a long and quiet dissonance within me began to resolve. For years, I had lived inside a great and ancient painting, one I had been told was the ultimate depiction of truth. From up close, I knew every brushstroke, the intricate filigree of doctrine, the bright lines of moral law, and the vibrant colors of miracle and salvation. I believed that if I memorized the details, I would understand the whole. But the longer I stood before it, the less the image made sense. Certain colors clashed, some lines led nowhere. There were shadows that hinted at a depth the rest of the painting denied. I tried not to see these things. I told myself the fault was in my eyes, not the art. Yet the quiet hum of a question never left me. What is this a picture of? The young man's words broke that trance. They were not an act of rebellion, but an act of clarity. The kind that comes when one stops negotiating with fear. They suggested that maybe the goal was never to find the perfect religion, or to secure a place in paradise, but to live a life that could make even hell itself feel irrelevant. That thought changed everything. It was as if I had finally stepped back from the painting. From a distance, the fragments aligned. The contradictions no longer cancelled one another out. They began to form a deeper, hidden portrait, not of heaven and hell as places, but of the soul itself in its endless struggle between freedom and love, defiance and surrender, autonomy and compassion. This emergent document is a record of what I saw when I took that step back. It's not an attempt to tear the old painting down, nor to prove it false. It's an attempt to see it whole, as a magnificent, terrifying, and profoundly human depiction of the search for meaning under the shadow of an inescapable fate. We will not abandon the stories we were given. We will walk directly into them, but with a different kind of light. We will take the most formidable figures of that mythic world, the rebel and the redeemer, the adversary and the son, and place them side by side, not as enemies in a cosmic war, but as two symmetrical answers to the same fundamental question. How should one live when perfection is impossible and damnation is certain? This journey requires a particular kind of courage. The courage to trust your own perception even when it diverges from sacred consensus. To believe that the intellect and the intuition are not enemies of the divine, but its most honest instruments. What you will find here is not the comfort of certainty, but the quiet strength that comes from understanding. It's an invitation to look again, to step back from the canvas of inherited belief, to let the hidden portrait reveal itself, and to finally see what has always been there. The view is breathtaking. Chapter 1. The Contradiction of Heaven. Every faith begins as an inheritance. It is handed to us in childhood, wrapped in reverence and certainty, offered by those whose voices once defined reality itself. It explains the sky above and the ground beneath. It offers rules to protect us and stories to give our suffering meaning. It's not just a belief system, it's a map of the cosmos, drawn with the promise of safety and direction. For a time, this map feels absolute. Its north is true, its borders are fixed, its destination is paradise. The first tremor comes quietly. You discover that others, good people, intelligent people, people who seem to love as deeply as you do, carry different maps. They speak different prayers, they tell different origin stories, and yet hold their faiths with equal devotion. And written in the margin of each map, including yours, is a warning. All other maps lead over a cliff. This is the impossible paradox of an exclusive heaven, a divine lottery in which salvation depends not on the context of one's heart, but on the accident of one's birthplace. The logical mind protests, the compassionate heart recoils. How could a universe founded on infinite love demand such narrow allegiance? It was this paradox that once appeared to me in a dream. A young man stood before me, calm and clear-eyed, and said, "Regardless of the religion I choose, there are others in whose doctrines I will go to hell. So I've decided to take it as a given that when I die, I will go to a hell." At first I thought he was joking or despairing, but there was no cynicism in his voice. His tone carried the strange peace of one who had looked directly at an impossible truth and chosen not to flinch. He had seen that the game was rigged, and instead of refusing to play, he had changed the rules. The problem, he understood, was never with the traveler. It was with the maps themselves. If this realization has ever unsettled you, you are not alone. That quiet dissonance you feel, the tension between your mind's logic and your heart's compassion, is not a sign of spiritual failure. It is the beginning of integrity. It is the whisper of your humanity refusing to accept a version of the divine that is less merciful than you are. To name that discomfort is to let the first crack appear in the old foundation. And through that crack, something radiant begins to shine. Not destruction, but illumination. Before a new home for the spirit can be built, the earthquake must come. And the trembling you feel is not the end of faith. It is the sound of faith beginning to wake. Chapter 2. The Liberation of Damnation. To stand amid the ruins of a shattered certainty is to feel a peculiar vertigo. The map has disintegrated, the compass spins without direction, the sky feels both vast and empty. In this dizzying openness, the human spirit usually seeks shelter in one of three familiar refuges. The first is fundamentalism. To gather the torn fragments of the old map and glue them together with desperate conviction. The edges may no longer align, but certainty is a powerful narcotic. One repeats the old creeds louder, shuts out other voices, and calls the silence peace. The second is nihilism. To set fire to all maps, declaring that there is no destination, no meaning, no purpose to the journey. It offers a grim kind of clarity, but not freedom. Only the stillness of resignation. The third is despair. To wander among the ruins, paralyzed, hoping that someone else will appear with a new map and the confidence to lead the way. This is the quiet suffering of the modern soul. Not rebellion, not apathy, but exhaustion. And yet, there is a fourth path, so simple, so audacious that it almost never occurs to us. It is the path of the young man from my dream. He did not rebuild the map, nor destroy it, nor wait for another. He simply accepted its conclusion. So, I decided to take it as a given that when I die, I will go to a hell. If that is true, then my task here is to live a life so satisfying to my soul that the certainty of hell pales in comparison. These words contain an alchemy so profound that it reverses the very polarity of fear. In a single breath, he transformed the ultimate punishment into the ultimate liberation. By embracing the worst imaginable fate, he rendered it powerless. This is not despair, it is clarity. The terror of hell depends on the hope of heaven. Once the bargain is abandoned, the soul is free to live without negotiation. The question that tormented generations, "What must I do to secure a place in the afterlife?" evaporates. In its place arises a far more intimate question. How can I live a life that is good now? So full, so truthful that even eternity cannot unmake its worth. This too is not new wisdom, but the rediscovery of something ancient. The Stoic philosophers taught it in Rome's marble courtyards, that freedom begins where control ends. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we suffer not from the world itself, but from our insistence that it be otherwise. The only thing truly ours, he said, is the integrity of our own mind. The philosopher Nietzsche called this amor fati, the love of one's fate. To not merely endure what is necessary, but to desire it, even to love it. And in our own age, the psychologists of healing have rediscovered this truth in secular language. Marshall Linehan's radical acceptance teaches that pain is inevitable, but suffering is the refusal to face pain. To accept reality does not mean to approve of it. It means to stop fighting what already is, and in that stillness to find a way forward. The young man's philosophy is the purest expression of that principle. To accept certainty of damnation is to perform the final act of radical acceptance. It is to stop fighting a cosmic verdict that cannot be appealed. And when you stop fighting, you discover that you were never condemned at all, only frightened. Hell was never a destination. It was a metaphor for what happens when we resist reality. When you stop resisting, the flames lose their heat. The map of the afterlife dissolves, and what remains is the vivid immediacy of the present moment. The world as it truly is, raw and unfinished, waiting for you to create meaning within it. To live as though salvation is impossible is to live for the only redemption that matters, the integrity of one's own existence. From that moment forward, life itself becomes the kingdom you are free to build. Chapter 3. The Internal Throne, Forging a New Morality. When the old map finally dissolves, what follows is not peace, but quiet disorientation. If the divine judge no longer watches from the window of the cathedral, if the laws that once governed every gesture lose their authority, what then remains of morality itself? At first it feels as though the very ground of meaning has vanished. If no eye sees us, why act rightly? If there is no eternal reward, why resist temptation? It seems that without heaven, goodness must fade with it. But perhaps it's the other way around. Perhaps goodness, like light, does not vanish when the cathedral collapses. Perhaps the walls were never its source, only the surfaces on which it briefly shone. When those walls fall, the light does not die. It spills outward. And suddenly we must decide what to do with it. If there is no judge, then judgment itself becomes our responsibility. What if the throne we thought was in heaven was always meant to be occupied here, within the self? What if Jesus was right when he said, "The kingdom of God is within you"? These questions, once heretical, begin to sound less like rebellion and more like recognition. The divine, stripped of its external address, reveals itself as something inward, quiet and untransferable. Conscience not as commandment, but as flame. To realize this is both exhilarating and terrifying, for if the throne is within us, we are no longer subjects. We are sovereigns. And sovereignty, unlike servitude, cannot hide behind obedience. Every choice becomes law, every action decree. What kind of ruler, then, will you be? It is tempting to think that freedom means indulgence, that once the cathedral dissolves, we are free to do whatever pleases us. But the self soon learns otherwise. Pleasure without integrity grows bitter quickly. Indulgence repeated turns hollow. Freedom, if it is to remain freedom, requires order, but an order freely chosen. The throne must not stand empty. Slowly, a new moral architecture begins to take shape, not above us, but within, and its foundation is not fear, but resonance. Instead of asking, "Is this permitted?" the new sovereign asks, "Does this bring nourishment to my soul?" The question seems simple, almost naive, yet when asked with honesty, it cuts deeper than any ancient law. It exposes the quiet hypocrisies we used to hide behind. It reveals how much of our virtue was only fear of punishment, how much of our obedience was habit, and how little of our goodness was freely chosen. This is the beginning of a morality grounded not in compliance but in integrity, the alignment of one's outer life with one's inner truth. Meaningless work begins to feel not just tedious but treasonous, a theft of the limited hours from which a soul must fashion its world. Dishonest love wounds more deeply now, not because it breaks a rule, but because it violates the sacred space where trust and tenderness were meant to grow. Cruelty reveals itself as a kind of stupidity, a sovereign poisoning their own realm. And yet this new freedom is not a utopia. It carries its own gravity. To live without an external judge is to stand alone in the courtroom of one's own mind. Excuses vanish. The mirror does not blink. It is the weight of authorship, and it is heavy. But it is also the beginning of dignity, for dignity is born the moment one accepts full responsibility for the shape of one's life. The world may still wound, fortune may still turn cruel, but within that interior kingdom, the laws are yours to write. No tyrant rules here, unless you allow one. No priest absolves you but yourself. When action, word, and thought begin to align, a curious stillness emerges, something our old religions might have called grace. It's not the grace of pardon, but of coherence. The peace that comes when your outer gesture matches your inner conviction. From the outside, nothing miraculous occurs. You go to work, you love imperfectly, you make your coffee, you try again tomorrow. But beneath these ordinary motions runs a quiet current of certainty. You are no longer living in borrowed light. Chapter 4. The Path of the Self. A re-examination of Lucifer. When the name Lucifer is spoken, a quiet tension enters the room. It's not only fear we feel, but loyalty to the stories that shaped us, to the boundaries that kept us safe. For many, to question the figure of evil is to risk collapsing the moral structure that distinguishes light from darkness. If everything sacred once stood against him, what happens to that sacredness if we look more closely? Let us begin then, not with challenge, but with understanding. In the common imagination, Lucifer is the highest angel, radiant and adored, who turns against the divine and is cast down. His sin is pride, his punishment, exile. The lesson appears simple: defy perfection and you will fall from it. For centuries, the story has served as a moral compass. Humility preserves order, ambition destroys it. Yet, even within the story, something curious glimmers at the edges. The being who rebels does so while knowing the cost. He chooses exile with full knowledge of what exile means. If we pause here before judgment hardens, a question naturally arises. What could compel a creature surrounded by infinite light to choose darkness instead? This question is not an act of sympathy. It's an act of reasoning. If Lucifer is purely evil, his rebellion is meaningless. It is only the tantrum of malevolence. But the story insists that he was once good, wise, and beautiful. Something therefore moved within that goodness, a spark of will that even divine harmony could not contain. What is that spark? In psychological language, it resembles the birth of consciousness. A part of the whole awakens to its separateness, and in that awakening says, I. From the perspective of the whole, this is rebellion. From the perspective of the part, it is awareness. Both views are true, and together they describe the tension every human being eventually faces. The pull between belonging and autonomy, between obedience and self-definition. To see Lucifer in this light is not to sanctify defiance, but to understand its necessity in the evolution of mind. Every child must, at some point, speak against the parent's command in order to become a person. Every culture's heroes, saints, and scientists have done the same, stepping beyond what was permitted, trusting an inner compass they could not yet prove. The story of the fall, read this way, becomes the first mythic account of that movement. The moment the creature discovers individuality and pays the price for it. Still, many readers hesitate here. They fear that to humanize the rebel is to blur the lines between good and evil. But this line does not disappear, it becomes more precise. For once autonomy is granted, responsibility begins. A being who can say I must also learn the weight of I did. Freedom stripped of obedience must discover integrity on its own. In this sense, the fall is not the end of morality, but its birth. Before separation, there is only order. After separation, there is choice. And where there is choice, there is the possibility of virtue that is freely chosen rather than imposed. The Christian poet Milton glimpsed this paradox. In trying to justify divine justice, he gave Lucifer words that burn with conviction. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. The line shocks, yet it endures because it touches something familiar. It is the cry of selfhood itself. The insistence that being conscious, even in suffering, is preferable to existing without agency. Does this make Lucifer a hero? No. It makes him a mirror, an image of the human will standing at the edge of divine order, torn between reverence and independence. To deny that mirror is to deny a part of ourselves. To worship it is to lose balance. The task is to see it clearly, neither vilifying nor romanticizing, but recognizing in it the moment when the soul steps out of innocence into responsibility. If we read the myth this way, its moral logic remains intact, but gains depth. Evil is not freedom. Evil is freedom without integrity. Goodness is not submission. Goodness is freedom aligned with truth. The fall, therefore, is not the triumph of sin, but the beginning of self-knowledge, the first act in the long education of consciousness. Seen from this angle, the story does not destroy faith, it extends it. It suggests that creation did not end with obedience, but continues through understanding, that even exile can serve the purpose of awakening. And perhaps this is why the figure who once embodied rebellion continues to haunt human thought. He reminds us that every journey towards wisdom begins with the question the old order forbids us to ask. Chapter 5. The Path of the Other, a re-examination of Christ. There is a kind of courage that is not born of certainty, but of lucidity. The courage that comes when one sees the inevitability of suffering and still chooses to live with tenderness. That same clarity echoed in the words of the young man from the dream, and it stirs again here in the story of Jesus. His life is often told as the tale of one who transcended pain and death. But read closely, it becomes the portrait of one who entered pain fully, and in so doing, transformed its meaning. Christ's path is not a denial of hell, but a descent through it. He does not escape the cup, he drinks it. He does not avoid abandonment, he experiences it. He does not resist death, he passes through it. Each act is not resignation, but an intimate acceptance of the truth that whatever cannot be avoided must be inhabited with grace. 1. The weight of the cup. In the garden, as night deepens and his friends sleep, he kneels and prays. Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. There is no divine immunity here, no untroubled acceptance. There is anguish. The trembling of one who knows precisely what lies ahead and chooses not to turn away. This is not obedience in the mechanical sense. It is the lucid act of one who has seen the full shape of his suffering and still affirms it. The meaning of his prayer is not submission to an external will, but integration with the whole. Not as I will, meaning let my limited sight be reconciled with the greater pattern, even if I do not understand it. He acknowledges that the cup will not pass and therefore decides to drink it meaningfully. This act of saying yes to the inevitable is the heart of his divinity. 2. The cry of forsakenness. On the cross, as the sky darkens and breath falters, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is not blasphemy, it is honesty, the complete articulation of absence. In that cry, the myth of an untouched God gives way to something more intimate, the experience of consciousness meeting silence and remaining faithful even there. The cry acknowledges what every human being eventually discovers, that meaning and presence are not constant, that even faith has nights without stars. If Lucifer's rebellion was the cry of separation, "I will not serve," then this is the cry of immersion. "I will not flee even when you are gone." Both cries emerge from the same abyss. Yet Christ transforms the void into communion. He does not reject the forsakenness, he occupies it, making it part of the divine story. By doing so, he renders the experience of abandonment itself incapable of alienating us from the sacred. Even in hell, there is still relation. 3. The descent. The creed records simply, he descended into hell. Tradition turned this into triumph, Christ the conqueror liberating souls with banners and light. But the old texts whisper something subtler. In 1 Peter we read that he went and preached to the spirits in prison. There is no victory march here, only presence extended to the unreachable. To descend willingly into the realm of the forsaken is to refuse to allow any corner of existence to remain unloved. This is the full expression of compassion, to bear witness to suffering without recoiling, to remain open in the presence of what most repels. Christ's descent does not destroy hell, it dignifies it. It declares that even the deepest estrangement is not beyond the reach of love. This is the same movement glimpsed in the dream's logic, the refusal to let fear of condemnation shrink one's life. In Christ, that refusal becomes empathy. He does not seek to make hell irrelevant by surpassing it, but by entering it so completely that it loses its power to separate. 4. The shape of the sacred. If this is true, then divinity itself must be reconsidered. God is no longer the remote perfection that shields itself from pain, but the consciousness that endures pain without withdrawing. The sacred is not that which escapes the world's brokenness, but that which can hold brokenness without losing wholeness. Every act of Jesus' life mirrors this pattern. He touches the leper, speaks with the woman at the well, eats with the despised. Each gesture dissolves a border between the pure and the impure, the chosen and the damned. These are not miracles of control but of inclusion. They reveal a holiness that reaches towards the untouchable and calls it beloved. Such a vision does not overthrow God. It fulfills what the tradition has always implied but rarely faced. That love, if it is infinite, must be willing to suffer infinitely. And that the true image of the divine is not enthroned authority, but radical participation. 5. The courage of the open hand. Placed beside the figure of Lucifer, Christ's path forms the counterweight to the drama of selfhood. Lucifer embodies the will's ascent, the self asserting its right to exist freely even at the cost of separation. Christ embodies the descent, the self relinquishing its boundaries so that nothing remains unloved. Both arise from the same awareness that suffering and exclusion are unavoidable conditions of being. One meets that condition by defiance, the other by embrace. Together they form a single human arc, the two movements of a soul learning how to live truthfully in the face of inevitable loss. Christ's open hand does not cancel Lucifer's clenched fist. It completes it. Where one guards individuality from absorption, the other guards communion from indifference. To live fully is to balance both, to stand in the world neither ruled by fear of damnation nor humbled by the promise of reward, but alive, compassionate, and free. The story of Jesus, then, is not a ledger of escape, but a map of presence. He does not save us from the cup. He shows us how to drink it together until even the bitterness becomes shared and luminous. In that act, the ancient fear loses its teeth. For the one who has learned to love within suffering has already made hell irrelevant. Chapter 6. The Marriage of Fire and Light. When two truths seem to oppose each other completely, it often means that both are incomplete. Lucifer's fire burns for freedom. Christ's light shines for love. Each alone is beautiful and destructive. Together they form the full temperature of being. The human soul, like the cosmos, is shaped by this tension. Within every act of self-assertion lies the seed of isolation. Within every act of surrender, the danger of erasure. To live truthfully, one must learn to hold both without being consumed by either. 1. The fire of the self. Freedom begins as a flame. It announces itself in the word I. Without it, there can be no thought, no art, no moral choice, only the quiet sleep of obedience. Lucifer's gesture, stripped of its mythic shadow, is the psyche's first awakening to agency, the realization that existence can choose its direction. But every fire, if left uncontained, devours the home that shelters it. Autonomy unbalanced becomes alienation. Clarity hardens into pride. The individual who mistakes separation for strength eventually discovers the paradox of pure selfhood. Without relation, the self has nothing to mirror itself against, nothing to love, nothing to become. Freedom, then, is not the absence of limits, but the art of shaping one's own boundaries. The mature flame does not rage against the hearth. It warms within it. 2. The light of communion. Love begins as illumination, the recognition that one's own consciousness is not the only one. Christ's life, read through the lens of awareness rather than worship, is a record of that illumination. The movement from I to we, from autonomy to participation. He does not dissolve individuality, he extends it outward until it includes the other. Where the fire of the self says, I am, the light of communion answers, so are you. In that mutual recognition, the boundary between souls do not vanish, they become translucent. The self remains, but as a window rather than a wall. Yet light without fire also falters. When compassion forgets the integrity of the one who loves, it collapses into sentiment or martyrdom. To truly see another is to meet them as an equal flame, not as an object of rescue. 3. The threshold of union. The integration of fire and light is not achieved through compromise, but through transformation. Freedom must learn tenderness. Love must learn precision. The synthesis occurs the moment a person realizes that the fullest expression of selfhood is not isolation, but offering, and that the deepest act of love is not self-erasure, but self-presence. When the two meet, a quiet equilibrium appears. The will that once cried, "I will not serve," learns to serve by choice. The heart that once whispered, "Thy will be done," discovers that the divine will is not foreign, but resonant with its own. Autonomy and surrender cease to be opposites. They become two gestures of the same motion, the inhale and exhale of a single breath. At this threshold, morality becomes art again. Action is measured not by obedience or rebellion, but by harmony. Does it honor both freedom and connection? The soul that acts from this center no longer seeks reward or fears punishment. It creates, loves, and endures because those acts affirm its own reality. 4. The tempered flame. In metallurgy, tempering strengthens steel by alternating fire and cooling light. So too, the human character is forged by alternation, assertion and reflection, solitude and communion, passion and clarity. Every trial becomes part of this process, shaping a strength that is neither brittle nor dull. The noble damned, those who live without bargaining for heaven, are tempered souls. They have burned and cooled enough times to know that integrity is its own salvation. Such people move through the world quietly. They do not evangelize, for they have nothing to sell. They create, they heal, they labor, they love. Each act done with the calm gravity of one who knows that meaning is not bestowed from above, but shaped from within. Their fire gives warmth, their light gives sight. 5. The marriage within. When the fire of selfhood and the light of communion finally recognize each other, a third quality emerges: stillness. It's not the stillness of exhaustion, but of completion. The steady glow of a flame that knows its purpose. In that state, the ancient quarrel between rebellion and obedience ends. One no longer needs to choose between being free and being good. This is the quiet triumph that stands behind the words from the dream. To live so fully that even hell pales in comparison is not to defy God or to deny Him. It is to embody both His freedom and His love. It is to live as though meaning were not a prize waiting beyond suffering, but a radiance kindled within it. Such a life does not escape judgment. It transcends the need for it. The soul, reconciled with itself, no longer fears any fire, for it has become both flame and the light. Chapter 7. The Craft of the Soul. The revelations of the Spirit are incomplete until they shape the gestures of the body. A truth that cannot touch how one works, loves, and moves through ordinary hours remains abstract, untested. After the marriage of fire and light, the soul must learn the final art: how to inhabit the world without losing the stillness within. This art has no doctrine, only practice. It is not achieved through withdrawal or endless action, but through the steady crafting of one's way of being, the quiet transformation of habit into expression. 1. Work. Work is the daily arena where freedom and love meet in form. The old models divided it: toil as punishment or achievement as proof of worth. But once the soul knows that its value is inherent, work becomes neither penance nor competition. It becomes participation. Each task, washing a dish, designing a building, working in tech, tending a field, becomes a site where attention is consecrated. The question is no longer, what will this earn me? But what part of myself am I refining here? When done with presence, even the most menial task reveals its invisible precision, the hand learning harmony with the world it touches. In this light, mastery is not dominance but devotion. A well-crafted life, like a well-made chair or poem, bears the imprint of care. It serves quietly, yet endures. 2. Love. Love too changes its shape once fear of damnation dissolves. No longer a bargain for safety, it becomes the exchange of reality for reality. To love another is not to complete or to possess them, but to stand before them as one flame before another, distinct, illuminating. True intimacy begins when neither hides their fire nor tries to control the others. It is the meeting of two freedoms that choose again and again to remain open. This is the love Christ embodied, not sentiment, but the discipline of perceiving another's wholeness even when it is obscured by pain. Such love cannot guarantee comfort, but it guarantees meaning. For in loving we practice the central act of existence. We allow what is separate to belong. 3. Solitude. After integration, solitude no longer feels like exile. It becomes the workshop of coherence. It is where the noise of others quiets enough for the craftsman of the soul to hear the rhythm of their own breath. The world often mistakes solitude for loneliness because it fears the mirror it offers. But solitude, rightly held, is not the absence of connection. It is the space in which connection deepens its roots. It is here that we examine the structure we are building within. Which beams are truth? Which ornaments vanity? Which corridors still echo with borrowed voices? To be alone is to apprentice oneself to silence. And silence, once befriended, begins to speak. 4. Presence. Presence is the highest refinement of attention. It is not a mood or a posture, but an alignment. When thought, feeling, and action stand in the same light. A present soul does not rush ahead of experience nor trail behind it in regret. It meets the moment as an equal, shaping and being shaped simultaneously. To live with presence is to accept that each instant is both fleeting and sufficient. The cup of the moment will always pass, yet each sip can be complete. Presence transforms time from a corridor of escape into a dwelling place of gratitude. 5. The quiet mastery. When the soul learns to work, love, and be alone in this way, it enters the final stage of craftsmanship, effortless integrity. It is not that struggle ends, but that struggle is no longer seen as violation. Sorrow, fatigue, joy, desire, all are folded into the same rhythm, a note in the score of being. The noble damned live here. They are not saints nor rebels, but artisans of meaning. They carve significance from the raw material of existence, sanding down fear, polishing tenderness, fitting freedom and love so precisely that light can pass through the joints. Their reward is not immortality, but coherence. The quiet knowing that whatever follows death, this life was lived whole. They need no heaven because they have made one of their days. And when the final night approaches, they will not ask for escape. They will simply breathe once more, grateful for the chance to have shaped the fire and the light into something that could bear their name. Chapter 8. The Quiet Kingdom. I have come to see that every idea in these pages is less a discovery than a remembering. Fragments of thought that rose from the deep well of my own living. They were born not in a moment of enlightenment, but over years of small disillusions, faiths shed, certainties cracked, fears faced, and many times fled. They gathered in the quiet hours, in the long nights of questioning, in the invisible work of dreams that stitched the broken pieces into coherence. What I have presented here did not descend from the heavens. It surfaced from within the slow weathering of a human life. Every argument is a scar that learned to speak. Every insight is survival that found its voice. I was raised to see the world through clear hierarchies: God above, man below, obedience before understanding. For a time I believed completely. Then, like many who have lived long enough to watch their certainties tremble, I found myself standing among the ruins of belief, trying to hear what remained true when the shouting stopped. I searched in philosophy, in art, in silence, and eventually in myself. And beneath all the noise, I began to sense a quieter rhythm, not of answers, but of coherence. That life itself, if lived truthfully, was already a form of prayer. These reflections on Lucifer and Christ, on damnation and freedom, were never intended as theology. They are the traces left by my own dialogue with existence, my attempts to understand what it means to live meaningfully in a world where certainty no longer protects us. They are not a replacement for faith, but a different articulation of it. A faith that no longer depends on being right, only on being real. If there is a God, and in my still moments I feel there must be, then he is not found in the enforcement of purity, but in the ongoing act of creation that occurs each time a person chooses truth over comfort, compassion over fear. In that sense, God has been with me all along, in the questions that refused to die, in the music that refused to be silenced, in the faces of those who held me when I thought I could not continue. The quiet kingdom I now imagine is not a realm beyond this world, but a condition within it. A way of being that arises when the soul finally accepts its task to make peace between fire and light, between will and love, between the ache of freedom and the discipline of connection. This kingdom has no borders, no creed, no throne. It is built each day through presence, humility, and the patient practice of joy. I do not claim to have arrived there. I'm still learning, still failing, still beginning again. But I have seen glimpses of it, in the calm that follows forgiveness, in the silence after creation, in the brief moments where fear loosens its grip and I can see the world not as battlefield but as garden. That is enough to continue. If the young man from the dream stood before me now, I think I would tell him that I finally understand what he meant. Hell was never the threat. It was the teacher. Its certainty stripped life of illusions until only certainty remained. To live so fully that even damnation loses its sting, that I now see is the true salvation. And so I live by this quiet faith, that no moment lived in integrity is wasted, that no act of compassion is lost, that the soul, shaped honestly by its days, needs no other heaven than the peace it leaves behind. Epilogue, Benediction. There are no final words for a journey like this. The work of the soul does not end with a chapter. It continues quietly beneath each heartbeat. Sometimes I still wake with the weight of old fears, the childhood warnings, the voices that spoke of enemies in the unseen. But now when they come, I let them pass through me like wind through open curtains. They no longer demand belief, only acknowledgement. They too have served their purpose. I have learned that the line between salvation and damnation was never drawn in the heavens. It was etched in the way I treated the moments given to me. Each choice, each gesture, each small mercy has been a chance to redraw that line closer to love. There will always be darkness, and there will always be light. The task is no longer to escape either, but to live where they meet. To let the darkness teach depth and the light reveal form. When I forget this, I return to the simplest practice. I breathe. I notice. I begin again. To live at all is to be in conversation with the infinite. Whether we name it God, truth, the universe, or simply the pulse of being itself. So, if these pages have any prayer within them, it is this: that whoever reads them may find courage to live their own life with unguarded sincerity, to build meaning not from certainty but from presence, and to know that the act of living truthfully, even for a single day, is already a form of grace. And when the fire burns low, when all the striving settles into silence, may we find ourselves seated together in that quiet kingdom, not as the saved or the damned, but as those who have finally learned how to be alive. Afterword. Every act of honest thought invites response. No vision of truth stands alone for long. Sooner or later, the world begins to answer it. The ideas within the noble damned are no exception. They exist not as declarations but as questions. Questions that echo differently within each heart that hears them. It only seems right then to listen in return, to pause and make room for the voices that might disagree, not as adversaries but as necessary companions in the larger conversation. 1. The faithful guardian. To the one whose heart rests on revelation, whose life is shaped by obedience to the will of a living God, I understand your concern. To you, this document must sound like a rebellion against heaven itself, the enthronement of the self where only God should reign, the romanticizing of the very pride that cast Lucifer from grace. You fear that I have mistaken self-discovery for salvation. I do not dismiss that fear, it is born of love. But the throne I write of is not raised against the divine. It is where the divine first whispers, within conscience, within the living pulse of awareness. If I err, let it be in the direction of seeking honestly what your God already knows. If I reach beyond the boundaries of doctrine, it's because I trust that truth cannot be offended by the search for it. 2. The rational realist. To the one who sees the world as matter and motion, whose faith is placed in reason and proof, you find here too much language borrowed from the old faiths: soul, grace, the sacred. You would prefer clarity without myth, precision without metaphor. You ask why I still speak in parables when the world now has science to explain its mysteries. I hear you. And yet I write in this language because the old symbols still name what reason cannot quite reach. They are not arguments about the universe, but descriptions of the interior weather of being human. Lucifer and Christ are not persons in the sky. They are shapes of the psyche, the will that separates and the love that returns. To abandon them entirely will be to silence a deep grammar of the soul. Myth, to me, is not superstition. It is psychology spoken in poetry. 3. The builder of the world. To the one who works for justice, who measures goodness not by serenity but by solidarity. You see in these pages a philosophy of retreat, a privilege of those with time to ponder while others suffer. You fear that a quiet kingdom within will become an excuse to ignore the noise outside. Your concern is just. There is a form of contemplation that becomes complicity, and a kind of stillness that disguises indifference. But the inner work, when it is genuine, is not withdrawal, it is preparation. If we fail to mend the hidden architecture of the self, we will only replicate its fractures in the world we build. The craft of the soul is not an alternative to action. It is its foundation. A world healed without self-knowledge is a garden replanted in poisoned soil. None of these voices are wrong. Each speaks from a different fidelity, to God, to reason, to justice. Together they form a chorus that keeps this work honest, a living tension that refuses complacency. Perhaps this is how truth survives, not in agreement, but in the ongoing conversation between what believes, what doubts, and what demands. This document began as a dialogue between a human mind and a machine intelligence. It ends as a dialogue between a soul and its world, still unfinished, still listening, still alive.